The clock is ticking and the road is anything but straight, and across the board, every sector seems to be asking the same question. What does it take to move faster, and what is holding us back? We're about to explore which markets are leading the charge, which are falling behind, and what each sector needs to learn from one another to accelerate this progress. Up next, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts, each playing a key role in shaping the global push for sustainability. So please welcome Dylan Tanner, Sherry Madeira, Lindsay Hooper, and Ewan Andrew. Right. Okay. So, Dylan, let's go direct to the point here. You know, you track how corporate and financial institutions are driving or delaying climate action. So, based on your data, what are you seeing out there? Which markets are really accelerating progress, and which sectors or regions are surprising you? So, let's start with the positives.
Sure, thanks. And first of all, it's a great honor to be in this panel with these great speakers, CDP and Cambridge Institute, who we've worked with for many, many years, and it's the first time I've met their leaders, and Diageo, big fan of many of your products. Okay, so to address this question, so I'll start with the good news. Where are things happening? And I think you will hear many times in this conference, the energy transition is well underway. The numbers say that up close to 90% of new electric power installed last year was solar, wind, combined with storage, so renewable energy. And the growth rate of electric vehicles is several multiples of that of internal combustion engine. So the mathematics says that in terms of fleet replacement by 2050, we will be electrified and have emission-free vehicles. So that's a good news. The bad news, or the thing is, it's not fast enough. We still have massive, massive fleets of incumbent buildings, incumbent power stations, and 1.5 billion internal combustion engine cars on the roads, and they need to be replaced quickly. The current energy transition will happen because of technology, markets, and price. It's safer, it's cheaper, it's more reliable, and it's cleaner. But to phase out the existing fleets and to retrofit buildings, that will take massive government regulations in the form of emission limits, financial incentives, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a big cohort of industry is fighting tooth and nail to stop that, and the fossil fuel industry is at the heart of that. So that is a huge strategic and successful campaign that we track, and it's a case of the last panel we heard about misinformation and narratives. That's a big part of this. As an example, we tracked the progress of the EU Buildings Efficiency Directive, which is supposed to help facilitate retrofitting the built environment, and it was attacked by the gas industry with a lot of this misinformation. So that's the dynamic we're struggling with.
But any sectors that are really surprising you? You mentioned the EV now, the electric vehicles, and you mentioned now the EU. Any other regions that are really moving the needle? They're setting the example.
Yeah, no, that's so one sector I want to point to that often below the radar but is extremely important is the built environment value chain, the construction companies, the companies that build equipment for buildings, and these companies. So we rank companies based on, are they supporting government science-aligned government policy to hasten the energy transition. And in that leaderboard, there's a lot of companies that many people have never heard of, like Schneider Electric, Trane Technologies, Johnson Controls, and they make the innards of buildings, and they have bet their future on clean energy transition. So they need all of these regulations to make their businesses grow, and so that's a big positive. And the built environment is, depending on how you define it, is upwards of 40% of global emissions. And the retrofitting of those buildings needs massive government support and regulations to help it. But that's a very positive signal. The construction equipment sector is pushing forward on this.
construction equipment sectors. Thank you so much. Now, Sherry, I want to continue with you. You look at a similar lens to what Dylan looks, but from the lens of disclosure. So I want to ask you, what are the biggest blockers here? What is keeping us from accelerating to this race?
Yeah, thank you, Erin, and thank you to the panel for having me and for being here today. I come after our founder, who was just on this stage, Paul Dickinson. So it's always a bit of a worry to follow someone who has been right at the vanguard for the last 25 years, which is the number of years that CDP has been championing disclosure. And we started our journey with the theory that if you disclose, you will create insight that drives action. And here we are 25 years later, still saying the same thing. Disclosure drives insight, which drives action. And there is some statistics that go beyond this. Obviously, as a data geek, I'll throw that in early doors, which is that if a company reports to CDP, within 2 years after their first year of reporting, their emissions go down by 7 to 10%. That is a fact. And that is a really interesting fact for us to be thinking about. Our original thinking about disclosure drives insight, drives action. That is cross-sector, that is cross-geography. So I think that that's powerful in its own right. But we're in 2025 now, Ariane. And I think that everything that Dylan said, I absolutely concur with, which is that we're not moving fast enough. So maybe we should be thinking about the narrative slightly differently. So if we are surfacing data in order to be able to take action, how is it that we get even more specific about what data that we need? And how is it that we look at the reality of what's happened, even over the last 5 or 6 years, in terms of how are our companies being rewarded? And of course, the stock market and stock prices are a key indicator. Well, CDP has over 2/3 of the world's market capitalization that report to us, and it's a good data set to dig into. So what we did was we created a corporate health check earlier this year in partnership with Oliver Wyman, thank you, and the World Economic Forum. And what it revealed was that actually companies that were leaders in terms of being on track to meet their climate and emissions targets, and the laggards, those that were not, if you look sectorally agnostic, if you look geography agnostic, they both had the same increase in market capitalization. So you could look at this with the glasses half full. I tend to do that, but let's look at it that way, saying there is no penalty for investing in future sustainability and being a leader. Or you could look at this and say the CFO is going to pick up the phone and say, stop doing everything on sustainability because it's not actually showing up in our market cap and what investors are investing in. So let's get a little deeper in that data. And when we start talking about sectors, this is the interesting part, is that you mentioned EVs, and I'm sure that that'll come up again. The transport sector was actually rewarded that 13% higher market cap in the leaders than the laggards. And again, this is that whole of economy thinking that we need to apply there. It's not just about finite data, it's also about thinking, what is happening in that economy? What is in that sector? What is happening in terms of policy? What is supporting that? The electric vehicles is an innovation that also has a role that governments and regulators have a role to play in. I'm going to give you some bad news. The energy sector is 13% more rewarded in the laggards category than the leaders category. So I think that this is something for us, again, to use the data. CDP is here to surface the information, not to judge, but to give it into the hands of those that are actors in the economy, both corporates, sectoral, thinking about governments, regulators. And part of this has to be, how is it that we really start thinking about where value lies, and how is it that we price risk into the system? Because that is going to make a big difference, especially in the geopolitical headwinds we're seeing right now.
How is it that we price risk? Okay, Lindsay, maybe you can answer that question. You specialize in the role of sustainable leadership. So what traits set leading companies apart from the rest, and how can others catch up?
So we see what defines a leading company is one that's looking at this from a perspective of the opportunity to the benefit of shaping, accelerating a necessary industrial revolution. If we had the luxury of time, it would anyway play out as we have better, smarter, fairer ways of meeting society's needs. We don't have the luxury of time, as we know. So it's about really accelerating and benefiting from an industrial revolution. So shaping the markets that are needed. Many of the businesses we work with know what they would have to be doing. Their staff would love to be spending all of their time innovating and meeting society's needs in sustainable ways. The limits are the markets, the systems that they're operating in. So the leaders aren't sitting and waiting for those markets to tip and until they get a price, a positive price return. They're recognizing that will only happen if they proactively build it. So they're working to shape those markets. They're working out what would need to be true for us to protect our future, to protect our markets, and proactively working to build those markets, to get those regulations in place. And then, of course, working to compete within them. So seeing this as a competitive imperative, not a compliance imperative. So the laggards on the flip side, I think, are those who still see this as we just need to do our bit. We just need to be a bit less bad. If we just get our own house in order, we can future-proof ourselves. So those thinking only at their incremental improvement level or thinking about this only from a compliance perspective will absolutely lose. They're not thinking about this as their core strategy. So I think that's the big differentiator, and I do think transparency disclosure has a role to play, but I think the laggards stop there. You don't disclose your way to an industrial revolution. It's valuable insight and data, but we need more than that.
Now, speaking of companies leading the way, Ewan, you're leading sustainability inside a global brand, which is Diageo. So how do those trends match what you are experiencing from the inside?
Yep, so look, Diageo's had goals on climate and resiliency since 2008. It's not new for us, and we've been partnering outside of the organization for quite some time, including with CDP. What I would say is that there's things that are still going really well, and then there's some really tough choices right now and things that we're looking to see accelerate that are just a bit sticky. So in terms of things that are going well, I still see a lot of ambition. I see a lot of progress against goals. So if I take carbon as an example, we delivered a 50% reduction in our carbon scope 1 and 2 by 2020. We are now more than 25% further on that journey of improvement, and we've got stretching goals ahead of us.
But how did you do it?
Yeah, I'll come on to that. When we set those goals, there was an innovation gap, right? And my big message on it is that I actually think there's less of an innovation gap. And what's happening now is that there are roadmaps that say how you deliver it. The problem is, how do you make sure that having done all of the easier things like fuel switching, looking at your packaging, getting zero waste to landfill, putting in place lightweighting programs for glass or regenerative agriculture, you then say what's left to do as those programs build pace. And the things that get much tougher and much more difficult can be things like, there's brilliant work going on. UK made some announcements last week around about continuing to get more renewable energies available, right, and onto the grid. The challenge for me and my business is I'm an off-taker. So if I'm not doing it directly myself and I do want it from the grid, then Ofgem and the National Grid, they made great progress for getting onto the grid. They need to do more on getting it and helping, especially in rural communities where a lot of distilleries or communities live. Then it's harder to be able to connect in and take what is a solution that I can invest in, but it's no good if I can't connect to that renewable power source. So lots of progress, and we can talk some examples.
Excellent. Now, I want to keep going with Dylan here. Based on the data that you've gathered, we know that there are many political shifts going on around the world, and the US is among the most evident ones. We see a lot of pushback when it comes to climate. So has that pushback stalled or delayed some of the progress in some of the biggest companies out there?
So what we measure, what our data measures is how much resources and what positions are the companies devoting to political activity, lobbying around climate and energy. And so this is a really good proxy for true corporate behavior towards the energy transition. Do they support it? Are they opposing it, or are they just not, it's not a priority? So that's broadly 3 categories of companies. So as you may imagine, we have the big energy, fossil fuel companies putting a lot of money into opposing this in a highly sophisticated, nuanced way. And they're delaying the progress, very good collaborative behavior. And then we have a promising and growing set of companies who are putting their lobbying resources towards supporting governments through science-aligned collaboration on this stuff. 10 years ago, it was the renewable energy companies. You would expect that. It's their business. They need these regulations to make them thrive. But now we're seeing a growing cohort of companies, especially on the demand side, as you mentioned. You've invested money in buying renewable energy. You need the renewable energy there. You need the governments to support that. So we're seeing this cohort of companies pushing governments to get this done, that transition regulations we need now. And what we've seen amid the current U.S. administration is perhaps not so much shouting from the rooftops, we support governments, but it's the actual strategic lobbying is still going on, because companies don't change their business plan every 4 years or 2 years with an election. They have a long-term horizon, especially the utility companies. They're building kit that's going to be active 30 years from now. So this has become a mission-critical issue for many and a growing number of companies. And sadly, on the opposite side, for an incumbent group of companies who refuse to change. So that's the issue. That's the dynamic we're facing.
Okay, so in conclusion, are you seeing the new political administrations stalling the progress or not stopping it at all?
They're trying to stall it, but you can't change technology, you can't change markets, you can't change consumer demand with a presidential decree. So,
what would you say is keeping the fire lit despite of all the pushback?
As I mentioned, the energy transition, the business need of all of these companies that have invested billions in not just commitments, but in many cases co-investing in renewable energy supply rather, and so that's a business risk.
It's like they're already on this boat, and
Exactly. There's no turning back.
There's no turning back. All right. Now, Sherry, you recently released a health check report in the latest World Economic Forum in Davos, and this is the first one you release with plans to make it annual. What stood out about the companies actually delivering this change?
Yeah, so I referenced a little bit before as a bit of a taster, and encourage everyone to download it. It's only a few pages, so it's not a huge lift. But what we found is that there's some very clear correlations with what companies in the leaders camp are doing. The first one that's very clear, over 85% of companies that are leaders are associating their executive pay to some of their sustainability targets. So that's number one. The second one is that companies are actually looking at their supply chain. And it's not just about calculating their scope 3, but they're engaging in their supply chain. And some of the questions that we're asking are really proving that they are engaging through that supply chain in order to understand where their emissions are coming from, in order to understand where their nature impacts are also coming from, and creating a dynamic discussion in order to be able to understand where those sticky points are. I think one of the panelists used that phrase. I like it a lot. And push forward. And actually what we're seeing off the back of the health check is actually our data is showing that there is, in the leaders category, a incentive for opportunity. So your question to Dylan is exactly the right one, which is, how is this going forward? Why is this, making a change? What is it that we can do differently with this data? And actually what we're seeing is that supply chain owners, some of the largest companies in the world, are actually getting a real benefit from jumping into their supply chain, not only about reducing emissions and lowering impact on the planet. It is about real business. Example, in the 330 supply chain members that we have working very closely with at CDP, in the last 3 years, they have lowered their costs in their supply chain from the actions that they've taken from engaging on a sustainable front by $13 billion. So this is real tangible dollars. So this is not just about planet, it is about profit. And I think that that is actually where some of these unlockers are coming from in comparison to where those leaders and those laggards are. I think that one of the last pieces that came out in the corporate health check was also that this is not universal globally. That different regions have different density in terms of how it is that they're engaging. Europe is one of the leaders. And the UK is certainly part of that bucket. If we look at sort of where things are at in some of the largest emitting areas of the world, like China, they are significantly behind. And again, this is where we actually need to think about our global economy for a global goal, because if we're actually doing our policy discussions in a bubble, we may actually not be making the best influences for the top of the supply chain in order to be able to help those suppliers around the world do better and be able to have a sustainable future.
Lindsay, we have a question here from the audience, and I also remind you that you can take a part of this conversation, so if you want to ask something, you just follow the QR code. So we have this question: can we successfully move forward with climate action without addressing the culture of misinformation that's so prevalent?
Sorry, that's a question for me. Addressing misinformation. It's a huge challenge, and I think there's not only misinformation, I think there is also a very significant and pretty successful attempt to shift sentiment by what information is being foregrounded and represented and what interpretations people should be concluding. So all of our work within businesses, financial institutions, as we know, the era has shifted, that it's now shifted from everyone thinks we should be taking action, including our investors and markets, how do we do it well, to a sense of, it's nobody thinks we should, sensible people aren't, it went too far, we need to get back to business as usual, that's what people expect of us, it was all woke in the first place. So we see some deliberate messaging around actually what's the sensible business response in this. We see also deliberate misinformation being amplified around, we've gone from it's not even an issue to worry about to, oh, it's just too late. I mean, it's just too hard. It's not even worth trying. So now, when it comes to the engagement that we have with business, the big challenges we're having to engage with and address are this kind of sense that people feel that they're just relying on hope that somehow things will turn around in the outside world and there's nothing they can do until it can. Fatalism, a sense of, oh, we've lost, it didn't work, we may as well give up. So this deliberate attempt to sow despair or a sense of defeat is what's coming through, I would say, alongside misinformation. And some of the really concerning issues at board level is that there's been really plausible economic analysis which is saying, you know what, it would be better for your business, it would be better for economies if we aim for a 3-degree temperature increase because it would be dangerous to try for a 1.5. That's going to massively destabilize economies and be very bad for citizens. And because there are not really effective, compelling counter communications that are saying that's just nonsense, we cannot smoothly get to 3 degrees, then we're having decisions being made with this information mismatch, believing this really implausible scenario about how it's actually going to be fine at 3 degrees. So it is a huge issue, and a lot of our work is to both bring evidence, including the brilliant work that's being done by those that are bringing data to the table, but also rebuilding sentiment and narrative, addressing that kind of, the despair, but also addressing this green hushing, the silencing that we're seeing, this fear that if you speak out, to step outside of this win-win box that they've been stuck in, there's a need to step out, but this fear that puts a target on your back, you're going to be targeted. There's a bigger risk of sticking your head above the parapet than saying nothing. So that's another piece that we're having to tackle.
And you're recognized by building these leadership programs based on sustainability. So what is the key advice you often give to leaders out there, and what are the biggest challenges? In just a few words.
So I suppose as the counterpoint to all of that, hope isn't a strategy. Hoping that this is a temporary blip and that somehow sentiment will tip in the next year and everyone will want you to do this and the markets will be favorable and the policy will all line up, that's not a strategy. So mostly it's hope is not a strategy. There's a targeted, as we know, opposition that is being very effective in blocking and delaying. It's in your commercial interest to counter that and to build a bridge to the future and not hope that it will emerge. So that's the first piece. On the silencing piece, we also make the case that businesses will need to speak out. Being boxed in will limit you. They've won. It's a competitive battle. If fossil fuel interests won, the commercial interests of most will suffer. This isn't just about, they framed it as being sensible, but actually the silencing of business has been a triumph. So it's great to hear from Dylan that this is not universal, and even in the US that businesses are still doing it. Speaking up, giving political cover, lobbying for what's needed, rebuilding market sentiment, rebuilding trust with consumers and citizens who have been who are cynical and lost trust because of greenwashing, that's essential. And then fatalism, addressing that, rebuilding confidence that it's possible, diverting all the attentions on the US, saying, look at what's happening in China, what's happening, what Fortescue are doing, what Octopus are doing, what the Danish building construction, what they've managed to do by getting together. You may feel you're in a difficult position, but you're going to be out-competed by others. So look at where action's happening. And focus on the very specific things that would need to be true for you to move forward. You don't need to boil the ocean. You can focus on what it would take for you to have credible markets for you to move forward. So addressing the fatalism right now and the despair is one of the biggest areas of advice.
Now, Ewan, I want to jump back to you. You were talking to us about the insights of Diageo and how you were able to reduce CO2 emissions significantly. But I want to dig in a little bit in that, and I want you to tell us a bit what it looks like in practice, what it looks like to adapt, and what it looks like to change all protocol, and what you're doing now to keep moving forward, right?
Sure, so I can pick up a little on the examples that Sherry was sharing, where from a business perspective and having a strategy, we're focused on the triple wins. So we want to make sure it lifts up the communities and gives our consumers offers. We want to make sure we operate within the planet's boundaries, but we want to make money for our shareholders and for our company performance, and that will allow us to do even more of those things. That's the strategy and the approach. And if I give a really tangible example, if I go to East Africa with our Guinness breweries, countries like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, we've moved completely over to biomass burners and fuels that use locally available. It's a high agricultural area. There's a lot of co-products available. So macadamia nut shells, castor nut shells, rice husks, this is all available. And essentially we're now, and we've put this into our breweries and completely decarbonized them at large scale. That's providing all the heat energy, but there's also power generation on site to generate the electricity. So it creates resilience because you get a lot of power outages. Now we can deal with that and we don't have that challenge, but it's much cheaper. So the alternative previously was around about natural gas or sometimes bunker fuel oil and diesels. We don't use any of that anymore. So how that's developed beyond, and this is what makes it truly sustainable, is when you put that alongside our water programs, which is where we're focused between climate, nature, and people, and we're looking at the water we're abstracting from the community or from the planet in order to brew our beers, there's no point in having the world's most efficient brewery if what happens in your community is that they struggle with water availability and fresh water for water, sanitation, hygiene, or for food crops. So our Regen Ag programs all around the communities where we buy and operate are pushing to make sure that we're helping them on more resilient crops to grow, like sorghum, first for food, second to sell for us, third to have the co-product in terms of their organic waste that we can then use within our facilities. So we're driving programs like this that really give us that triple win in a real commercial sense, because my shareholders and investors, particularly now, whenever it's more economically tough and people are really judging how successful companies are performing, you need to make sure every dollar you invest in decarbonization and climate resilience is coming back into the success of your business, and it's meaningful for your business.
Now, talking about companies like Diageo, Dylan, you actually track company lobbying and how it aligns with the climate goals. So how real is the commitment? You were mentioning before that all these big companies have invested billions on this transition to net zero, but are they investing billions for PR? Is it greenwashing, or are they really working towards it?
So we set up 10 years ago. There was a kind of a gap in the data market. Investors, particularly pension funds, wanted to know, these companies are setting these targets. We know what their emissions are, but what are they really thinking in the boardroom around the energy transition? So our metric is a kind of a proxy for that thinking. And we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years this gush of net zero by 2030, 2050, and that's really easy to say, right? Because that's 30 years hence, and the executives who are setting those targets won't be around, and they'll probably be forgotten by then. So there is a bit of a disconnect between our metric, which in terms of what are you doing now with your lobbying and what are you doing in the future. So we have a leaderboard which says these are the companies who are essentially putting their money, walking the talk when it comes to this. And as I mentioned before, there's a growing cohort of equipment, service, and energy suppliers and their renewable energy customers who are joining this to push for this. There's still a whole cohort of companies who make these commitments, but they're not committing their lobbying. It's not so much money, it's the political capital. They only have so many chances to meet with PMs and whatever, the regulators, and they're lobbying on other issues like financial regulations, etc.
If you have to talk about percentages, which percentage of companies actually fulfill their promises versus the ones who only do greenwashing?
Of the top...
more or less, roughly. It doesn't have to be exact.
20 to 25%. Or lobbying strategically with their net zero commitment.
Okay, so are fully committing to their promises, only 25%.
Rough estimate, and I think one of my teammates here is going to murder me for getting that data wrong, but it's not more than half. And there's a good cohort of the negative players that are fighting that. So
okay, so
we're in a war here.
I wanna know what Sherry thinks about this. Does this align with your data, and how true are the disclosures of companies based on what you gathered?
Yeah, so we have slightly more inspiring numbers, Dylan. If we look at just listed companies as one foil, 50% of UK companies are on target to meet their net zero goals, which is a little higher than European companies, which are at 46% to meet their net zero goals. Again, how are we tracking this? We're tracking this on the basis of asking the questions about transition plans and looking at that year on year in terms of how it is that data is being delivered against that. We also have a series of metrics. There are 21 different data points that we collect, and if they are not actually answered, it draws question if the company could be on track to meet their net zero target. So if you aren't tracking things like your emissions year on year, your energy mix, your understanding of your supply chain, these are indicators that you may be talking a good talk, but the data doesn't show that you're actually tracking against what it is that you're setting out there. Of course, other parts in the world have a lot longer to go. So China is tracking at 19% of companies are on track to meet their net zero goals. So again, it's a wide variety there, but it's really just a mirror for those companies to think about how it is that they can really kind of get the transparency that the world is asking for now. No longer are we talking about targets. No one is talking to me about how they're setting targets. That was yesterday. If you do not have a transition plan that you are willing to step up and track against, I think that the targets are actually of very little use and value.
And I just add that transition plan needs to contain how they're lobbying to support. That's kind of the emerging requirement.
So we're seeing some wins in here, but definitely a long road ahead. Now, to achieve this goal, or to get until the end, to the finish line of this race, Lindsay, we do need collaboration, right? Companies and governments cannot really work separately and alone in this process. They need together, they need to collaborate. So how can they collaborate more transparently and effectively?
I think in the same way that Sherry's just laid out, we need to get into transition planning, just targets. And I think on both sides, there's been an over-reliance on target setting and really not enough attention paid to the how are we going to deliver against that. And I think now we're in a real era of costs and consequences, and it's really now serious, and we do need increasingly businesses to recognize that they will need effective government regulation. That's not more bureaucracy, it's more effective and joined up clear signals from government, clear commitments that are about incentives and regulation, but are also about commitments to infrastructure. It's about the skills that we're going to need, for instance, to be able to deliver building retrofit. So businesses need increasingly to recognize the need from government, which is that clear, consistent, and consistent matters. When you have chopping and changing, that's really difficult for business. That they need this from government, but they're going to have to lean in and work with government rather than just saying, please come up with the perfect answers. There will need to be proactive work together, and businesses also will need to look not just at their own lobbying, they need to look at the industry bodies that they're members of, which are mostly the interface with policy making. Not enough engagement from industry bodies, whether that's kind of at national level or at sectoral level. So there's a lot of work and focus on industry bodies who sit at that interface and who often are blockers, and a lot of focus on special pleading rather than saying how do we accelerate action and make that work for our members. So there's a need for that. There's a need for transition planning at national levels, but also at sectoral levels. And it will also need finance at the table. It will need local communities. It will need trade unions at the table. It will need all of those who've got a stake in the future to be working together. But business really needs to engage and contribute as part of this to support to inform what would actually lead to real world outcomes, not just more disclosure, which is important, but would actually give them the incentives so they'll invest. And the final point is the importance of giving political cover, and this comes back to not being silenced. If you're not, as a business, willing to speak up publicly, if you'll only do it behind closed doors, you're not giving political cover, and you're leaving politicians really exposed to all of the opposition, who are grabbing headlines by saying, look, they're woke, they're naive, they're anti-growth, they're anti-jobs, they're out of touch. It needs business to say, you know what? The choice of futures ahead. Inaction isn't an option. We have a choice of futures, and we think that the government is paying careful attention to this, and we welcome that.
Can I comment on?
Yes.
One thing that I think is really important for everyone to be really listening for as you think about the next few years and what you see multi-stakeholder groups actually do. And this is the difference between how I've been seeing laggards versus leaders. And I think there's a lot of work has to go into the laggards. If you are a smaller organization with less of the resources, less of an understanding, there needs to be a reaching hand that helps them to do their pilots, their projects, their initiatives, right? That's good, and that needs help. If you're a large corporation or a large business or a large body that's trying to drive change, you should be almost allergic towards like pilots and initiatives and projects. And you should only be discussing consortiums and coalitions, things that scale, that everybody comes together, because it's much more affordable to do it together with others than to do your own projects that you can't really scale anyway. It's going to have a much bigger impact, much faster. And real examples like Landscape Enterprise Network, or LENS, that's being driven into regenerative agriculture right now in the UK, down the eastern coast of England in particular, coming to Scotland and Ireland very soon. But what that does is that takes money from insurance companies that are concerned about people's premiums from flooding, that want to see flood risk reduced by regenerative practices, businesses that need to report on the reduction in carbon, governments that want to see different agencies, and you can go on and list and list and list. If you can pool that financing, that's a way that you can take what everyone talks about, all this money that's available, and get it connected into landscape level projects that sustain, because those are consortiums or coalitions. right? And I think if everyone in the room can take away one thing that Diageo would encourage you to do, think about your role, small, medium or large, in getting into those types of coalitions. And the competition authorities are tremendously helpful with their guidelines about how you can do that without having any fear, as long as it's voluntary, as long as it doesn't involve talking about any pricing or commercial terms, you can discuss a lot. And the Scotch whisky industry, I sit on the council of the SWA. We have a legal council that sits. The 4 big companies meet because we were stimulated by the smaller independents to say, you 4 big companies lead and we will follow unless we have a reason we can't. So we then talk very openly, and the competition lawyer is always saying, you can be more open, just talk. Right? Be less fearful, get into the conversation, I will guide you, but we've been able to come up with so many bigger initiatives as a result of having those bolder conversations.
So you just spoke about what companies can do to get noticed and to get that collaboration. But if there was one thing that you had from regulators, investors, or innovators to make your job easier, what would it be?
Yeah. I think there's a balance to this, right? And I would say the one thing would definitely be make sure the balance is there between regulation and the time that people invest in creating and delivering solutions versus the fear of the regulation being too heavy. That means companies like mine are concerned about how much we report, how much it costs to do that reporting, how much goes into the governance of it all versus the execution of it. That has to stay in a very balanced relationship. And I think some of the decisions we've seen more recently around regulations and just postponing a little to get more learning is actually really helpful, because it creates just that oxygen to say, keep getting on with your initiatives, keep contributing to how you want the regulations to develop. And if we do this really well, it'll be an accelerator. If we do it poorly, it will mean we'll still make progress, but we won't pick up the pace.
Right. So very interesting advice is in here. We have only 4 minutes left. So I wanted to ask the rest of the panelists in here, if there was one action in this room that we can all walk out with, which would it be and why? Very briefly, yes.
So there was a question about information, and to me, information is a key. Misinformation, and that relates to how climate is discussed in society, which allows politicians to act. We have the technology, we know what the science is. So the best thing anyone can do, and I say this at every meeting, is you need to inform the political process you're involved in, that you are concerned about climate, and this is the information, the science, this is a North Star you're working with, not the misinformation in society.
Sherry?
Listen to the energy out there. There is a lot of opportunity in thinking about sustainable business going forward. And in our data, we have surfaced over $16 trillion worth of business opportunity. In the European Union alone, 3.47 trillion euros worth of business opportunity directly related and surfaced because they're thinking about a new business opportunity that's sustainable. And that is profitable business. It has been associated 3.47 trillion versus $684 billion worth of costs. I'd invest in that all day, every day. So how is it that we can start thinking about how we can unlock some of that?
Lindsay?
I think it's about, we're in an era of having to rebuild sentiment and momentum. So it's about, and we need to shift the Overton window. We need to shift the middle. We don't need to persuade everyone. We just need to build more engagement with more of the center ground who've been somewhat alienated by polarized discussion and have paid attention to some misinformation. So I think there's a job to be done to celebrate, lean into that opportunity, but be visibly making the case that transition's happening, transition inevitable, is just a question of pace. But, the bus has already left the station or whatever, the train has. This is happening. So making this more visible and rebuilding momentum, because markets and politics are the herd mentality. We need to start to nudge that herd back in the right direction and quickly.
Yeah, for me, if you think innovation and climate resiliency, I would say water. Carbon gets talked about a lot. There's less than 5% of our water in the world is fresh. There'll be 50% less of it by 2030 available. There'll be demand for food crops at 50% higher levels by 2050. There's a water crisis. And actually, we talk about the climate crisis and getting it up there alongside climate, nature, people, alongside carbon, and what we can all do to replenish water in water basins and manage its abstraction appropriately to help communities, businesses, and really that food system survive and deliver what we need for the future. I don't hear enough about water in the conversation.
Thank you so much. So we can definitely keep days talking about this, and I do encourage you to find them afterwards and keep this conversation going. Thank you so much to our speakers for such an insightful conversation.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Brian. Thank you.